to meet you. It's awesome.
And this is Marina, who's going to be with us today. Do you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Marina. I'm a graduate candidate almost
Yay.
in a couple of weeks at the history department. And I work with authoritarianism in Brazil, women under the Brazilian dictatorship. And I do translations whenever we have Brazilian speakers on campus.
So, as I mentioned, thank you all for being here. There is a purpose we're organizing this final panel with all of you today. As I mentioned yesterday, many political activists talk about police brutality, mass incarceration, racism, institutional racism within the criminal justice system. And we think about these current forms of racial violence, I would say, as long legacies of racial slavery. But it's one thing to make a political statement about these legacies. It is a different thing actually to view the historical connections between two different experiences in history. So yesterday we were talking about the experiences of enslavement, the making of distinct racial regimes, and even the making of distinct constitutional regimes, criminal justice system. We spoke about different forms of racial violence. We spoke about lynching. We spoke about state violence. We spoke about this very particular experience of racial violence in Brazil because it is violent, but it's not always explicitly racist, and because of that, it is more difficult to challenge. So our conversation today moves on to bring people who have been dealing with criminal justice system nowadays, talking about criminology, talking about racism. And this is also the moment in which I would like us to think beyond the walls of academia. This is the moment in which we were trying to build a conversation that is not exclusively a conversation among scholars, but in which we can actually reach out to society, and especially to those who have been fighting against racial oppression and against institutional racism and racial violence nowadays. So this is, of course, all of us here are studying our specific topics, but you are the ones who have been dealing with current forms of racial violence and this present experiences, not only thinking about theory, not only thinking about theses, books, but thinking about the political implications of what is done in academia. So I encourage all of us not only to listen to their presentations, but to engage into a discussion in which we think not only as scholars, not only as political activists, but how we think about ourselves as citizens who are trying to face this huge challenge that is racial violence in the 21st century. So I would like to begin with Nicole's presentation, then Dina will offer her presentation, Marco, you will be the last one closing the session, and then we're open for debates.
May I ask how long? I have just
I mentioned yesterday that
just about
20 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is not a rule.
Yeah, I will make sure.
Please feel free to read.
I like the time just to be sure. I'll stay just to see how. Okay, well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to join you all. It's such a busy time. So I was running from another meeting and I wish I could have been here for more sessions. So I think that there's a serious criticism in the field of sociology. And there's a criminologist named David Garland that talks about sociology and criminology as having a very presentist view, which is that a lot of sociologists and criminologists treat the criminal justice system and all its manifestations of racial violence as if it just poof, popped up from nowhere, with very little introspection and consideration of history. And I will admit that as a sociologist, I was not trained in history at all to think about history. There is a stream of comparative historical sociologists that look at archives and those types of things. But again, I thought, well, that's the boring stuff. You know, I don't know that. I'm a sociologist. I'm in the field in real time. So I think in being around more historians, it really forced me to confront that this field, especially that has so many links to chattel slavery, needs to always have a historical perspective. And that's why today I want to talk a little bit about indicting the field of criminology, the academia that represents criminology. And I say in full disclosure that my first job was in a criminal justice department. And it was through being in that department alongside those types of criminologists that I really understood the extent to which academia and criminology specifically had a role in reproducing racial punishment. So today I want to go and talk a little bit about a pandemic project that really was like the bane of my existence at the time, because no one had ever told me to read Du Bois. And so I made it all the way through a PhD program in sociology. And the only required reading I had to do for theory was Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Simmel. That was it. Read those. They called it the dead Germans. And you can be a sociologist too. And of course, what I learned is there were so many limitations and actually a lot of painful dilemmas that I had as an academic researcher, which is I had very little tools to understanding racism as a sociologist. If anything, what I was told specifically as a graduate student is that if I acknowledged race and racism, that I would be seen as a quack like Eduardo Bonilla Silva. So I was directly told that in no uncertain terms. Now, the department that I came up in was Northwestern University sociology. And there is a wonderful, famous scholar named Alden Morris. And what I didn't realize at the time, he was the dean. And so I didn't really get a lot of face time with him or mentorship with him because he was in this leadership role. But he was writing a book called The Scholar Denied. And it was about sociology's complicity in marginalizing Du Bois from the entire discipline. And what happened was, without understanding Du Bois and without understanding and centering race, it made the work that I was doing all the more difficult. I mean, I struggled. I was like proving race and racism to mostly white scholars who treated it as though I was measuring unicorns and hearts and flowers and rainbows. Well, how will you see a magic unicorn when you and I'd be like, well, I could just walk into the court and the prosecutors were using racial slurs, or the prosecutors or the sheriffs were leashing a black man's chair who had the audacity to ask for a trial, almost like reenacting the scene from Abu Ghraib where you see a white woman leashing an Arab man, right? These are racialized photos. And without Du Bois and other historical understandings of where that racism, where the racial origins of those images and symbols come from, you're left thinking, poof, what do I do with this, right? And so that's kind of where I felt very stuck, if you will. And so it took writing Crook County and really creating a book that centered racism as an engine of one of our legal institutions, the most sacrosanct institution, where we are told that due process protections insulates the courts and the judges from expressed overt racism. And what I try to show is that the coded colorblind racism that is state sanctioned in the institutional practices can inflict a type of racial violence that has, these terribly violent ends for Black and brown people. So I revisited Du Bois and realized that I had to kind of teach myself the things that I missed, that was part of my responsibility as a scholar. And I wrote this article called How Does It Feel to Be the Problem? A Call for Du Boisian Criminology and Theorizing Racial Punishment. And one of the things that I tried to do is similar to Alden Morris, is to reinstate Du Bois as a central founder of sociology and criminology. So the study of crime, et cetera, the study of our legal institutions. And the whole point of a Du Boisian approach to criminology is to center race and racism as this kind of central starting point that really constitutes the entire social organization of criminal justice policies, practices, and the institutions themselves. And so I want to just contrast that with what we would if you were to ignore Du Bois, as I was told to do, or ignore race and racism. The burden was on the researcher to kind of prove racism, prove it. So the assumption in all this line of literature and in sociology and in criminology is that it is a racially innocent project until proven otherwise. And so it is like a form of gaslighting, because if you're starting there all the time, you never get past to more interesting questions like how. How is it manifesting? How are they inflicting racial violence? How are they inflicting racial degradation? how is the power of a white accusation more important than actual evidence? So this Du Boisian approach would really interrogate the how criminal justice institutions and stakeholders reproduce racism through legal apparatuses, that is one of the most essential tools, right? And that punishment is part of constructing the racial order. It is the physical and cultural performance of our color line, where segregation and stigma is reenacted under the guise of due process. And this approach really disrupts a field that continues to define, that it's in some ways that it's defining features, which are racial inequality. And this kind of myth of a colorblind justice system is largely ignored, as though they have these kind of blinders on. So what I argue in the paper is that we need to kind of begin to start changing the gaze, if you will. So the entire construct of criminology is gazing on what Du Bois would say, the problem of Black criminality. So that's what they would say. They still use these terms. We're trying to solve criminality. I mean, they even can take away the word Black, and when the coded term within the field is criminality. And what they mean is Du Bois's age-old question, how does it feel to be a problem? And so I want to change the gaze. And again, this is before I was doing this before I had the language to truly feel empowered to do it, or teach my students to do it, or require other scholars to respond to what I was doing. Largely, I asked criminology, how does it feel to be the problem? Because their empirical research is continuing to legitimize this race-blind approach that is not really, it's not rooted in empirical reality. It's not rooted in historical reality, but it allows mostly white researchers to be absolved of the harm that white stakeholders and white institutions and white laws are able to do. So I say we have to start looking, if we start with the Du Boisian approach that centers racism and racial violence in the epicenter of the research questions we ask, we then can shift from those who are quote unquote on the margins to those who create the conditions of marginality. And I think, again, when you have these criminology programs, there is, again, this kind of race-blind delusion. And it was interesting. I have a friend named Osagio Basogi. He's at Berkeley. He wrote a path-breaking book on race and racism that is called Blinded by Sight. And he had this inspiration to study blind people who had never seen race. Because like gender, we don't remember when we learned about racial divides, right? It's so intrinsic to who we are as young people or children that we don't remember the socialization process that got us to understand racial difference. And so he looks at how blind people, especially white people, are taught about those racial differences in terms of texture and hair and all these different things that they have to learn through sighted people. So you get this methodical reproduction of racial order and how it's taught from generation to generation. And so when we think about criminology as a field, its power has been basically having this race-blind delusion where we continue to talk about the insignificant of race. It's not about race. And one of the things, I think you started with this idea of how do we, beyond academia. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do is translate my research into the public sphere. So I do a lot of, I was saying on national TV, racism is fueling police practices. Racism is the code of violence and silence. And at the time it was like, oh, explosive. Like, did someone just say racism on TV? Like, do you have evidence for that? I mean, there was really this kind of, at what point can the scholar say these are racist practices? And in criminology, it's pretty much never. It's never. I would say in the legal academy, it's almost never as well, but that's like a different discipline, but one that is very close. The other thing is in criminology, there's not like a quote unquote settled paradigm. So a lot of the researchers talk about this struggle. Even the more critical ones will say, well, why isn't there a settled paradigm about the social organization of criminal justice? And largely it's because they have this big problem is that the defining feature of the discipline they don't want to talk about. So they struggle. They have little tiny theories that explain little phenomena, but they don't have these grand theories that people can kind of work with. And so I want to go back to like when we think about what Du Bois did in the Philadelphia Negro, when white researchers came to him, they were in some ways passing the buck. They were saying, listen, we have a Black problem in Philadelphia and it's pretty unsavory. We don't really want to deal with this. So let's commission Du Bois to deal with this piece that is really beneath us. And largely, what they wanted Du Bois to do is they wanted affirmation that Black crime was caused by Black cultural deficiency. That was the answer they wanted, right? It almost they predetermined the findings because they had these racialized lens of who Black people were and the deficiencies they brought with them from the South, et cetera. And Du Bois came back with something quite different, which is kind of one of the first structural analyses of crime. And it was masterful in terms of his brilliance, in terms of the painstaking data, the knocking door to door, et cetera. And it was rooted in this idea that white power created violence. Those structural conditions created by white people and prejudice created patterns of disadvantage that caused crime. White people were a variable. And white people didn't want to hear that, right? And so he was really shifting the gaze away from the so-called Black dysfunction onto white violence so that they were culpable, that white institutions were culpable. And this was a real disruption to criminology. And the legacy of that denial, that racial denial, Du Bois, as you know, was ostracized. He was, chased away from the field. And in many ways, it allowed him to create his own, it allowed him a certain amount of freedom away from white scholars that were continuing to allow him to work from a closet, if you will, and be marginalized, at Penn. And the legacies of that are still surprisingly powerful. So this is a quote from 1991. Two Black scholars named Young and Sultan said, "Since the turn of the century, African-American criminologists have studied these issues, crime. Hundreds of books and articles and monographs describing or explaining these phenomena. They've also delivered theoretical or research-oriented papers at scores of conferences and professional meetings, yet their contributions have been virtually ignored. But on the other hand, ideas advanced by white criminologists have assumed prominent position in the fields of criminology. Millions of dollars are spent developing, testing, and refining their theories, and literally billions of dollars are spent implementing programs based on their ideas. And yet ideas advanced by white criminologists have consistently proved utterly impractical, obscenely costly, shockingly inefficient, and wholly ineffective in their results. Not to mention the racial harm that all their ideas have, right? All of them. And so I think, the legacy of that, and when we think about, there's a lot of things that happen to criminology along the way. I looked up these two scholars, and I haven't seen any publications since 1991. So them saying these things, possibly, I'd love to find them now, but I'm sure it's extremely painful. They likely were chased from the field themselves, just like Du Bois. To me, this is one of the most honest, profound statements I've seen about the difference between a white lens, a white analytic lens, and what Black people, Black scholars like Du Bois wanted to contribute to the field. And so, one thing that I talk about that is somewhat painful is that, with the exception of a scholar named Sean Gabadon, Du Bois is pretty much erased from the field of criminology. He's persona non grata, even to a group of Black scholars that they are founding kind of Black criminology. And I was excited to read their work, thinking it would be extremely critical. And unfortunately, the thrust of the work is basically this: Black problems should be solved by Black people. And so therefore, Black criminology. So we have a crime problem, we should solve the crime problem. And it does not feel emancipatory. It doesn't feel critical. It doesn't feel Du Boisian. Du Bois is not mentioned anywhere in their opening manifestos, et cetera. And they use some of the same stigmatizing tropes about Black crime and quote unquote dysfunction and respectability politics that their white criminologist counterparts do as well. And so they are in some ways part of that racial harm. And I think it's an eye-opening it's very eye-opening to think that as a scholar of color, we know this can happen, but we also can produce these stigmas if we fall short to have the courage to resist these fields. But it's not easy, right? There's how many careers have been ruined by doing the right thing? How many tenure files have been ruined? And so, what I end up, kind of concluding with in this paper is that, this idea of criminologists, they continue to look at African American involvement in the criminal justice system as the inherent social problem that they seek to solve. Solving the problem of Black criminality is the entire thrust of the field. Crime statistics and their interpretation perpetuate these kind of racist beliefs and practices. And similar to the criminologists like Samuel McCune Lindsay, who was the person that commissioned Du Bois to study the Philadelphia, this kind of white establishment pretty much owns this apparatus of criminal justice scholarship. They own the NSF money. They get paid by police and policing institutions in a way that would be similar to big pharma taking money paying AstraZeneca paying a researcher here at Brown. We would have to disclose our conflict of interest, and there is no such disclosures in the field of criminology. And so there were numerous turning points. There was a white criminologist that did come forward and say, listen, Black criminologists have something to say. And he started to say, listen, folks in the Chicago school, they're studying in Chicago, they have something to say. Ida B. Wells, she has something to say. Du Bois, he has a whole school. He has something to say. But even in that turning point with this very prestigious white criminologist opening his eyes and saying, maybe our data is off. Maybe our data is proving, again, he wouldn't say this, our data is proving our own racism. He was saying, perhaps our analytic conclusions are not okay. And so this is, kind of one of the things that we are left with a concern by a criminologist named David Garland, who actually wrote some really critical things. So he wrote a really fabulous article about lynching as part of our criminological history. It's a wave of white violence. It's white criminality, right? Here you have centuries of white people doing vigilante violence, right? Pulling people from homes and making false accusations, etc. We don't treat that as a crime wave in America. Right. Okay, it's still a crime wave. Right. It is still a crime wave. That young boy that went to the wrong house, Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, we don't treat that as a crime wave or any police-involved shooting. And so one of the things that David Garland says is that despite he has this amazing critical lens, he calls that popular justice, and he says we need to say that that's part of our criminological history. So on the surface, I'm like, that feels very Du Boisian, but yet he still does not have the right language to say Du Boisian scholarship, Du Boisian criminology, because it was erased back in time. The same way I didn't have that language, but he's speaking in the 90s, and he says, the methods of imprisonment, he says, increasingly seem to be irrational and dysfunctional. And so what I end up arguing is that we need to have this Du Boisian perspective. We only think that because we fail to see the racial history and how it extends from Du Bois's era or beyond. I mean, we can even go farther beyond, and brings us into the modern day. And so if we do that, we start to ask different questions. We start to stop assuming race neutrality and start assuming that things have either racial disparity, racial inequity, racial violence, whatever language we want to use for these things. I hate when people say, wow, these institutions are failing. I'm like, wait a second, they're not failing. They're fulfilling their promise. They're fulfilling their promise. One of the most impactful things about revisiting Du Bois is that Du Bois himself was criminalized. In Great Barrington, Massachusetts, that claims him as one of the, their wonderful sons of that town, he stole a handful of grapes. And when he stole a handful of grapes, alongside other white boys, they brought him into this court, and Judge Jason Dewey was ready to send Du Bois to a jail or a juvenile hall or juvenile prison, basically. And it was the white principal of the school that says, no, this boy is different. This Black boy is different. Save him, judge. And they did. So Du Bois even knew that he dodged that bullet. He dodged that incrimination that had a promise that it was safer to have a black boy like Du Bois learn a trade under lock and key than certainly have him free. And so again, when we look at things happening from today, we see them then as extensions of that racial order, of that racial history. We see the criminalization of black children as part of a long history that Du Bois himself was subjected to. We see how white allegations or accusations become self-fulfilling prophecies that our system pretty much anoints. So we just had the death of Emmett Till's accuser, was yesterday. And we see that it just took the power of a white woman saying it, implying it. And that was enough to execute on, on his death and his murder. So I want to end with saying that this Du Boisian criminology is a real disruption to the field of criminology. They haven't really read this yet, but I know they're not going to be happy. They pretty much fired and stopped hiring every historian. There used to be historians in criminology departments. All of them are pretty much gone. When they passed, they never were hired again, because if they were to sit there, it would be way too disruptive to the types of concerns that they have. And so I think, again, to me, this feels very liberating, because if we no longer have to prove racism, right? If we can start by saying these are inherently racist institutions, then we can push to the how. We can push to things like, one of the things I talk about is the performance of racial degradation ceremonies. And those are ways in which white people can manifest and perform the racial order, perform unworthiness, perform the rituals like they did in lynching ceremonies of lynching that showed a kind of white solidarity. We can get some kind of more radical critiques on the system that are, I don't even want to call them radical. They're radical to people who deny racism. They're truthful to people who acknowledge it, right? And so that's kind of where I want to end. And I'm excited to hear your feedback on it and to hear other again, this is my first attempt at being a Du Boisian scholar. I joke that I was like, I never thought I would be a Du Boisian scholar. I didn't know, but you always have to keep pushing and learning. So I realized that this was one of those types of papers that I wanted to, probably do justice to, especially all the Black and brown scholars that have been pushed out of these criminal justice programs. And I myself will say that, Crook County was an affront to the white criminologists that voted on my tenure there. And I was tenured there, but not because they wanted to tenure me. If anything, they didn't want me to exist. And so it didn't matter how many publications, it didn't matter being published in Criminology, the flagship journal, it didn't matter how, 11 awards for one book, awards for criminology, it didn't matter, because at the end of the day, my gaining tenure was an affront to a system that rewarded the racial blinders. And by by being open about racism in the criminal justice system was an attack to their entire epistemological view. And that in and of itself was very dangerous. And so, I share that because there are still many Black and brown scholars, before we implicate Black criminologists and say, oh my gosh, what sellouts, et cetera, the stakes of getting fired and being marginalized in a profession are very serious. We can talk about it more. The stakes of being attacked online, and which has happened to me when I've spoken about the fact that, like, in many criminology programs, they won't even take, I asked about, well, do you teach a class on race and racism? And they said, no, that's too controversial a topic. So they just don't even teach it. And then the class that they do teach is called crime, minorities and crime. And it's so interesting because, people of color are also victimized at higher rates than white people, right? They're in areas that police neglect, right? So I know there's so many different reasons for this, and it's not the black on black crime argument. It is about social neglect. It is about total deprivation of communities. It's about violence prevention programs being taken away from poor communities, et cetera. There's so much research, so nothing to do with cultural dysfunction. And yet they still have a class called minorities and crime, right? Creating that link for a whole new generation of students that may not have thought that otherwise. And so I leave with that note because, again, it's beyond just our scholarship, it's beyond just academia, but it's also the teaching of the next generation, and also how that teaching and how that money and academic work leads to actual policies and funding that creates more violent programs that legitimize the system. So, thank you.
Boa tarde a todas presentes. Esse trabalho que eu vou apresentar aqui não está desconectado da minha atuação ativista, do meu trabalho acadêmico. É uma autoethnografia, uma etnografia da minha família, da minha avó. Está aqui o título, que é um questionamento dentro da família sobre por que não existe foto da nossa vovó.
So good afternoon to all. So the work she's presenting today is connected to her larger work in criminal justice, but it's an autoethnography of herself and her family, coming from a questioning of why are there no pictures of her grandmother. And the title, I'll translate it to you now. It's called it's Intimately Situated Notes on Social Memory, Historical Trauma, and the fungibility and Black fungibility in post-slavery life. The term fungibility, I'm going to take this moment just to introduce because we talked about this before. It's used conceptually in Brazil, fungibilidade, to mean something that is easily substituted or marketable. So it's the question of the body merchandise paradigm.
Eu vou ler para não perder as informações, para ajudar na tradução também. Bom, esta apresentação são algumas notas de um artigo que está em construção ainda entre eu, minha irmã e meu irmão. São 3 pessoas da família. E a nossa intenção é localizar e interpretar os distintos tempos sociais, cronológicos, políticos que perpassam as histórias das famílias negras ou racialmente ambígua, como a minha.
Right, so these are the notes from a work in progress, an article they're writing as siblings. And the idea is to identify the different times, sociological, cultural, political, that trespass the lives of Black families or families like hers that are racially ambiguous in Brazil.
Minha avó se chamava Aurora Paixão e dela pouco se sabe. Registros da sua curta existência chegam em fragmentos precários.
My grandmother was called Aurora Paixão, and little is known of her. There's only fragments that arrive from her life.
Morreu num dia chuvoso, lutou muitas horas com a criança atravessada no canal uterino. A parteira tentou por horas a fio salvar a mãe e bebê em vão.
She died on a rainy day, and her birth was very difficult.
Ela tinha naquela data incerta da década de 1950 pouco mais de 35 anos de idade.
In the 1950s, she had a little over 35 years old.
Talvez.
Maybe.
Não sabemos.
We don't know.
Na ausência de uma lápide que informe pelo menos a data do nascimento, os poucos resquícios de informação sobre a vida e morte de vovó Aurora.
In the absence of a grave that can tell us date, at least the date of birth and date that she died, the little fragments of the life of Grandma Aurora,
recuperados de recordações fragmentadas provocadas a partir de uma fotografia na qual está ausente na parede da minha casa.
So the fragments that they have are partially recuperated from this one photograph that they have, from which she's absent from the photograph that is currently in the wall of Dina's house.
E é essa escrita que é um desafio, como diz Said Hatman, como nós podemos compreender o luto, como nós podemos, se o evento ainda não terminou.
And here's a challenge as exposed by Saidiya Hartman, which is how can we comprehend the grief and the events if the event lingers on, if it doesn't have an end.
Como podemos escrever uma história se a gente não conhece essa história?
How can you write a story if we don't know what that story is?
E eu situo a minha fala aqui sobre como nós reconstruímos informações sobre a vovó Aurora a partir de memórias subalternas.
And I situate my talk today on how we reconstruct the life of Grandma Aurora coming from subaltern memories.
Os silêncios, as histórias não ditas, os discursos interrompidos,
The silences, the untold stories, the interrupted discourses.
os resquícios burocráticos de documentos deteriorados pelo tempo,
The leftover records from documents that have been deteriorated over time.
e no contexto maior das relações raciais, das relações de poder, que marca a fungibilidade e dispossessão ontológica e material negra no Brasil.
And in the larger context of power relations that mark the fungibilidade, the markability of Black life in Brazil.
O seu apagamento nos provocaria a perguntar qual é a história que a família de Aurora, como tantas famílias negras no Brasil, conta a si mesmo sobre raça e racismo no Brasil presente.
So her effacement lead us to question what is the story that Black families in Brazil tell themselves about race in Brazil currently.
De que maneira nós podemos reivindicar os fantasmas dos nossos ancestrais, das gerações passadas até o Atlântico Negro, que ronda a nossa existência, para confrontar as relações de colonialidade do presente?
How can we recuperate the ghosts and face the ghosts that haunt us from our past back into the Black Atlantic? Can you repeat?
Que rondam a nossa existência
That continue to haunt our existence
para confrontar as relações de colonialidade do presente.
and confront the relationships of coloniality in the present.
E como recordar e trazer os mortos para o mundo dos vivos,
And how can we remember and bring the dead back into the lives of the living, the world of the living?
ou quase vivos de tão pretos?
Or
Somos
almost
socialmente
living. Yeah, or almost living of
baseado então numa autobiografia, num relato oral de parentes da minha avó, em análises de arquivos, entrevistas estruturadas na família, com a minha mãe, com as minhas tias, sobre concentração agrária no sul da Bahia, sobre violência, sobre migração urbano-rural, reconstruímos a vida da vovó Aurora.
So based on a series of interviews and recollections from the family, aunts, cousins, they are reconstructing the life of Grandma Aurora and telling a story that is about rural migration to urban sites, about rural concentration in southern Bahia, migração,
Violência e migração rural urbana.
and the violence against rural populations.
A partir disso, nós reconstruímos a vida de Aurora.
From that, we reconstruct Aurora's life.
A morte da minha avó, ela não faz parte das conversas em família, não é que isso seja um tabu.
So the death of my grandmother is not part of the stories that we tell our family. It's not a taboo. Just don't talk about it.
A sua existência não é registrada como uma lembrança do passado.
Because her existence is not registered as a memory of the past.
É uma vez ou outra que a visita de algum parente desperta uma curiosidade.
Once in a while, when a relative comes to visit, curiosity gets piqued.
Nós sabemos por tia Frê que ela se parecia com tia Alice, uma mulher negra, forte, de cabelo curtinho.
From Aunt Frey, we know that she looked like Aunt Alice, who was a black woman, a strong black woman with short hair.
Nossa mãe se lembra muito da sua fisionomia, mas se recorda de alguns traços que Merentina, uma vizinha nossa, traz no olhar e na estatura baixinha.
So my mother remembers her face, but also some of the characteristics that a neighbor reminds her of, as the short stature, a little bit stronger.
O pouco que sabemos vem de relatos pessoais de Celsa Paixão, a filha de Aurora, minha mãe.
The little that we know comes from the personal sayings of Celsa Paixão, my mother, her daughter,
Que tinha 9 anos de idade quando da sua morte.
who was 9 when she died.
São memórias de sofrimento que se associam à sua existência.
It is memories of suffering that associate themselves to her existence.
Porque a morte de Aurora jogou nos ombros de Celsa toda uma carga de responsabilidade do trabalho reprodutivo doméstico.
because the death of Aurora threw onto Celsa's back all of the charge of the reproduction of domestic labor.
Lavar, cozinhar, cuidar dos irmãos mais novos, trabalhar na casa de farinha.
Washing, cooking, taking care of younger siblings, working at the flour house. Casa de farinha?
Trabalhar na casa de farinha, não sei como.
Working at the, I'm not familiar with that expression. Is it a specific site? É um lugar específico de trabalho?
De mandioca, né?
Farinha
It's a place where they
Yes,
grind
yeah.
flour.
Mais tarde, Celsa perderia no parto, dias após, o seu primeiro filho, repetindo um padrão de mortalidade infantil e gravidez de risco que as mulheres do seu tempo estavam expostas.
A little later, Celsa would lose her first child, childbirth, reproducing a pattern of infant mortality to which Black women are exposed in Brazil.
E para compreender melhor essa relação do sofrimento com a história negra, nós tomamos emprestado o termo monstruosidade íntima da geógrafa Pavitara Vasudevan, que nos seus estudos sobre raça e toxicidade, ela faz uma análise sobre a aproximação dessa relação e nos ajudou a pensar um pouco sobre a ausência da avó, sobre a relação de sofrimento em que a minha mãe está imbricada nas lembranças e das pessoas que, quando fala da minha avó também, sempre traz uma história de sofrimento, para compreender melhor a intimidade, né, como uma análise crucial para compreender também o capitalismo racial nessas relações que atravessam as famílias negras.
So to understand them, to understand better this patterns of violence in which all these stories is imbricated, they have borrowed the concept of monstrous intimacy, and that kind of builds on these questions of attachments of memories and violence and intimate environments as it is a family. Não sei se tem mais alguma coisa específica sobre monstruosidade íntima que é importante.
Sim, acho que eu vou ter que é melhor ler porque eu vou acabar.
Okay.
Bom, nos estudos críticos de raça e pós-colonialidade, né, a Pavitara ela é geógrafa, então ela faz uma análise, ela argumenta que a intimidade é uma análise crucial para compreender o racismo capitalista, o projeto político e ecológico em múltiplas esferas, incluindo o local de trabalho, a comunidade, a paisagem.
So Pavitara is making an argument that intimate spaces are integral to understanding these processes of racism, and that includes the questions of environment, ecological violence, sort of like a capitalist racism that surrounds intimate spaces.
E que as pessoas negras estão expostas.
And that to which Black people are exposed to.
E que se torna uma relação tão íntima que elas nem percebem.
And it becomes such an intimate relationship with violence that they don't even understand that they are in this position of vulnerability.
E esse conceito nos ajuda a pensar não somente os processos inconscientes de vulnerabilidade das pessoas negras, a morte prematura.
And so this concept helps us to think not only on the unconscious process of vulnerability that Black people face in Brazil, but also the premature deaths of Black people.
Mas também na reprodução das relações de colonialidade presentes no fazer memória.
And also the reproduction of colonial dynamics in the process of memory making.
Nas recordações não ditas, nas intimidades das dores.
On the non-said recollections, the intimacy of pain.
A intimidade negra com a dor e o sofrimento fazem do esquecimento uma estratégia política.
So Black intimacy because of the pain and suffering makes forgetting the effacement of these memories she's talking about a political statement.
Da mesma forma que dita intimidade exacerba o controle sobre nossas vidas.
In the same way that intimacy exacerbates the control over their lives.
A partir dos traumas históricos que assombram a intimidade do ser negro.
So this is all stemming from the historical trauma that haunts the black being in Brazil.
No caso da família descendente direta de Aurora, da qual nós participamos, por um lado, esta monstruosidade íntima, ela se manifesta na desorientação identitária.
So in the case of the direct descendants of people like Aurora, this intimacy monstrosity manifests itself as a type of identity disorienting.
Exatamente. Na desorientação identitária sobre as raízes de africania e ancestralidade negra.
So the identity disorienting from like setting them apart from their African roots and like Africanidade. How do we translate African roots?
I think African roots work well.
A minha mãe teve 9 filhos e boa parte da família racialmente ambígua sob a denominação parda.
So her mother had 9 children, and a good part of the family identified themselves under this ambiguous racial category in Brazil, pardo, which would be mixed race.
Se identificaria muito mais com os ideais de morenidade do que o exercício doido de olhar nos olhos do monstro e encontrar-se consigo mesmo.
So they would identify themselves much more with this racial ambiguity of mixed race in Brazil than looking in the eyes of the monster and understanding themselves as black.
No entanto, essa fuga, como mostram nos trabalhos sobre sistema prisional, sobre violência policial,
nonetheless, this sort of escape, this fugue state,
No entanto, essa fuga do monstro, ela não nos livra das violências com a polícia.
Nonetheless, this fugue doesn't save us from police violence, the carcerary violence,
do emprego doméstico,
from domestic work,
da falta de acesso à saúde,
the lack of access to
das mortes
healthcare,
prematuras,
from premature death,
que fazem destinos de pretos e pardos selados pela despossessão física e ontológica.
that seal the destiny of black and mixed race people in Brazil to be that of ontological dispossession.
Ainda que não exista uma identificação ou que as pessoas fujam desse monstro de encontrar-se consigo mesmo, na sua negritude, o sistema prisional brasileiro, por exemplo, na América do Sul, o Brasil é o país, né, que está em primeiro lugar com um nível de encarceramento alarmante. E a maioria são pessoas negras.
So even though there's this sort of attempt to escape from being understood as black or understanding themselves as black, Brazil still is the leading country of incarcerated black people in the world. So the identification, the personal identification with the racial category or not, doesn't keep the system from executing its racism.
Nesse sentido, as tentativas de negar o pertencimento identitário demonstram, na verdade, o que o professor João da Costa Varga chama de hiperconsciência racial.
So this attempt to escape an identity category actually goes towards what João Costa Varga has called a hyper-conscious of race.
Hiperconsciência racial. E, portanto, a tentativa desesperada de fugir da negritude.
And that's why there's a desperate attempt to escape blackness.
É por isso que a vida e morte da vovó Aurora, como as interpelações raciais dos e das suas descendentes, não pode ser lido fora do contexto da escravidão.
And that's why the life and death of Grandma Aurora, as well as the racial interpolation of her descendants, cannot be read outside of the context of slavery.
As digitais da travessia do Atlântico Negro estão na vida da minha mãe Celsa Paixão,
The fingerprints of the Atlantic slave
da tia-avó Frê, das suas netas, netos que driblam o mundo para resistir.
So the fingertips of Atlantic slavery are in the lives of my mother, of my aunts, cousins, and grandkids who are fighting in the world to escape it.
A pós-vida da escravidão, segundo Hartmann, pode ser localizada nos padrões de vulnerabilidade que roubam a vida da população negra.
So the post-life of slavery, according to Hartmann, can be understood in the, sorry, because he handed me the paper, but can be understood in the patterns of vulnerability that haunts Black life.
A colônia se faz presente nas relações de subordinação que fazem pessoas como meu bisavô Pedro Paixão morrerem nas favelas da cidade de Salvador à espera de uma aposentadoria que nunca chegou.
So the colony makes itself present in the lives of Black people who, like my great-grandfather, died in a favela in Salvador, waiting for retirement, for a pension that never came.
E é por isso que o tempo da escravidão é melhor entendido, como diz Hatchman, como um tempo suspenso, que não pode ser medido pelas coordenadas cronológicas ou pelas narrativas oficiais, dos arquivos oficiais.
And that's why slavery time can be understood, as Hartman suggests, as a suspended time that is not marked by official narrative or chronologic time.
Um segundo ponto que tratamos nesse trabalho em construção também é sobre a negritude como fungibilidade e despossessão.
So the second point that we make in this work in progress is about Blackness as fungibility, as I've said before, as this body merchandise, as these easily substituted bodies in Brazil.
Que, de acordo com o professor Frank Wilderson, a nação ela é fundada em oposição às pessoas negras. O regime de cidadania é concebido em referência negativa para os não cidadãos. A humanidade mesmo ela é racialmente imaginada como uma comunidade branca.
So, according to Frank Wilson, the nation is constructed in opposition to Black people. Citizenship is defined by who is not a citizen. And is therefore marked by its whiteness. Humanity is then marked by whiteness under the nation.
E tal estrutura de antagonismo sustenta a fungibilidade da vida negra como uma moeda mercadoria que afirma a humanidade das pessoas brancas.
So the system sustained this fungibility, this easily substituted space for Black life as the currency that actually sustains then back the white power.
E no que diz respeito à memória social da escravidão e sua vida póstuma na família Paixão, essa fungibilidade explica a negação do crime, ao mesmo tempo que reposiciona toda e qualquer pessoa negra como um potencial ser escravizado.
So in respect to the Paixão family, this fungibility puts forth, I'm sorry, can you repeat just the start of the sentence?
No que diz respeito à memória da escravidão, a sua vida póstuma na família Paixão, na minha família, essa fungibilidade, ela explica a negação desse crime, ao mesmo tempo que reposiciona toda e qualquer pessoa negra como um potencial ser escravo.
So the social memory of slavery repositions Black people and negates crime. Qual crime? Which crime? Sorry, because I don't understand what that crime is in relation to.
A negação da minha existência.
Oh, crime. Okay, the crime is the negation of her existence. So it justifies this crime. It doesn't understand it as crime, and positions all Black people as potential enslaved, right? As potentially enslaved.
Isso. No imaginário social,
In
nas
social
práticas
imaginary.
institucionais.
And in social imaginary and institutional practices.
Então a escravidão deixa de ser um acontecimento histórico que pode ser decifrado nos arquivos oficiais para se converter em um paradigma da racionalidade.
So slavery goes from being a historical fact that can be found in archives and records to being a social paradigm.
Nem eu nem meus irmãos conhecemos meu bisavô Pedro Paixão.
Neither I or my siblings met my great-grandfather.
Em casa nós temos um retrato na parede que o caixeiro viajante da época juntou duas fotografias do meu bisavô e da minha bisavó.
So at home we have this picture that a traveling salesman at the time connected two different pictures, one from my great-grandfather and one from my great-grandmother.
Não ficou uma cópia fidedigna porque o desenhista embranqueceu meu avô negro retinto.
It's not really an accurate depiction because the picture taker whitened my grandfather, who had very dark black skin.
A bisavó ele não mudou tanto, mas o cabelo longo e a sua aparência indígena fazia com que as pessoas fizessem uma leitura que ela era uma mulher branca.
My grandmother, they didn't change her a lot, but her long hair and indigenous facial features made people read her as white.
Sabemos que o meu bisavô nasceu em 1900, 11 anos depois da assinatura da Lei Áurea do Brasil, que foi em 1888.
We know my great-grandfather was born in 1900, which was 12 years after the Declaration of Abolition in Brazil.
E os pais de Pedro Paixão nasceram por volta de 1860, sob o regime da escravidão.
And his parents were born around 1860 under slavery.
Então, os avós de Aurora podem ter sido levados para o recôncavo baiano, onde eu nasci e onde a minha família viveu, ou foram comprados por algum lavrador branco para trabalhar na lavoura da mandioca, que era a especiaria do Baixo Sul, naquela região.
So my grandmother's, Aurora's grandparents could have been bought and sold and brought to southern Bahia, which is where she's from, to work in the manioc production, which is the main agricultural production.
No início do século XIX, a Baía de Camamu, essa região, era a maior produtora de mandioca.
So at the start of the 19th century, that region was the biggest producer of manioc.
Uma economia de subsistência sustentada pelo trabalho de pequenos produtores, negros, escravizados e livres que formavam a maioria da população local.
So subsistence production that was formed largely from small agricultures, a lot of free people and formerly enslaved and enslaved escravizados também, and enslaved people that formed the local production community.
Pedro nasceu em Liberdade, na Terra Negra de Vila Santarém.
Pedro was born as a free man in the black land of Terra Santarém, that region.
E foi desses pequenos produtores.
And was one of these small agricultural producers.
No entanto, nessa época, em 1940, 1950, com incentivos fiscais do governo brasileiro,
although around the 1940s, because of tax incentives from the Brazilian government,
a Odebrecht começou a estender os seus tentáculos para o projeto de desenvolvimento agropecuário no Baixo Sul da Bahia.
Odebrecht,
Lá ela estava.
which is a development company, they have many holdings and things like that. At that time, they started expanding into southern Bahia and kind of going over the land of these small producers.
O que mudaria radicalmente a paisagem da região, implantando um regime de terror contra pequenos pulseiros.
Which radically changed the landscape of the region, actually implementing a regime of terror against the producers.
Sobretudo descendentes de africanos que ocuparam as terras na pós-escravidão.
Above all, the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans who occupied those lands after the abolition.
E a presença da Odebrecht demarcou o território com violência, despossessão e territorialização do capital monopolista.
So Odebrecht's presence marked the land with dispossession, oppression, and the establishment of new capital monopoly capital.
Meu bisavô teria sido constrangido ou convencido a vender o seu pequeno pedaço de terra.
My great-grandfather would have been forced to give his little piece of land up.
E assim o sítio foi rapidamente incorporado ao aglomerado da Odebrecht e ele foi mais um dos pequenos produtores expulsos daquela região.
And so it was quickly incorporated into Odebrecht's new territory, and he was one of the agriculturists who was expelled from the region.
Com pouco dinheiro que recebeu, comprou um barraco na cidade de Salvador e lá faleceu por complicações de diabetes, esperando a aposentadoria que nunca recebeu.
So he got a little bit of money with which he bought some property, how would we do?
Some kind of
Precarious housing in the city of Salvador, where he died waiting for his pension that never came.
O roubo da terra, segregação espacial, privação de direito à saúde, todos esses fenômenos interagem em produzir a monstruosidade íntima que conecta a avó Aurora.
So the stealing of the land,
segregação
the spatial
espacial,
segregation,
privação do direito à saúde,
and the keeping people from their right to health, all shape,
fenômenos
they're all phenomena that constitute this intimate monstrosity.
que produzem a monstruosidade íntima, que conecta a morte da vovó Aurora ao seu passado de neta de pessoas escravizadas. Teria o meu bisavô, o pai do Pedro Paixão teria sido escravo?
So this intimate monstrosity connects the past of the slave descendants, enslaved people descendants as Grandma Aurora. So was Pedro, her great grandfather, a descendant of the enslaved people? She'll never know.
Ao seu passado de neta de pessoas escravizadas,
Yeah, her past as the granddaughter of enslaved people,
de filha de mais uma vítima dos roubos das terras,
as the daughter of somebody who was a victim of stolen lands,
e de mãe de uma dúzia de filhos e filhas que seguem trabalhando no emprego doméstico, morando em espaços segregados nas grandes cidades,
and as the mother of a dozen of sons and daughters who continue to work in domestic work in segregated urban spaces.
e lutando contra doenças preveníveis e evitáveis como Celso Paixão e sua irmã Margarida Paixão.
And fighting against preventable diseases like Celso Paixão and her sister Margarida Paixão.
É a monstruosidade íntima da colônia que se desmistifica ao não evento da emancipação negra celebrada na memória nacional brasileira como 13 de maio, dia da abolição da escravidão.
It's the mystification, it's the demystification of. I'm going to ask you to repeat that one because that one is a
O dia do não, como o dia do não evento, o dia da grande festa da abolição da escravidão.
It's the demystification of ideas as the big day of the non-event, which is the day of the commemoration of abolition in Brazil, which is not really commemorated, right?
Yeah, it is. No, I'm sorry.
Para a grande festa da democracia, sim.
Yeah. Anyways,
Pra nós.
I'm sorry.
No.
Já estou caminhando para finalizar. Geralmente os estudos sobre memória têm um ponto de partida que são os crimes de Auschwitz.
So usually memory studies have a starting point, which is Auschwitz.
Ok. Cadê? Eu me perdi. E é amplamente citado, né, ao afirmar que o Benjamin, um autor famoso sobre memória, é amplamente citado ao afirmar que escrever um poema depois de Auschwitz é um ato barbárico.
So Walter Benjamin, who's very well known, is widely cited as saying that writing a poem after Auschwitz is a barbaric act.
A aberração do Holocausto roubou a capacidade humana de narrar um passado brutal, ou narrar o passado seria trivializar a barbárie dada a ausência de um léxico político que desse conta do terror.
So the aberration of Auschwitz removed from the humanity the capacity of narrating the past, and so telling history with trivialized brutality.
No Brasil, em diálogo com Benjamin, os principais trabalhos sobre memória geralmente se debruçam no período da ditadura militar e escreve o período da escravidão, né? Que o período militar é o divisor de água entre um Brasil normal e um estado de terror implantado no AI-5.
So in Brazil, memory studies usually use the military dictatorship, which happened from 1964 to 1985, as the splitting of the waters into a regular Brazil and a Brazil invariably changed by trauma, as epitomized in the AI-5, which was an institutional act that removes civil rights, but they don't take into account slavery.
E numa perspectiva negra, sobretudo do feminismo negro, é sintomático que as principais discussões sobre memória, elas se situam na literatura incisiva, embora ainda marginal, por retratar a condição das pessoas negras ao longo da história, principalmente da mulher negra.
But from a perspective of Black studies, especially Black feminists and Black women, there's an incisive yet marginalized literature that focuses on the lives of Black people in the memory and trauma studies fields.
porque faz uma análise pelo olhar de dentro das suas experiências e que desafiam os arquivos oficiais da história.
Because it's an internal analysis coming from their own experience that challenge the official records of history.
Se os estudos sobre memória demasiadamente eurocêntricos se recusam a ler a experiência negra com a mesma importância da história oficial,
If the memory studies, which are overly Eurocentric, refuse to read the Black experience with the same carefulness and same importance as the official history,
é a memória subalterna de autoras negras como Conceição Evaristo, Grada Quilomba,
it's the subaltern memory of Black writers like Conceição Evaristo, Grada Quilomba,
Maria Firmina dos Reis, Beatriz Nascimento,
those are names.
Beatriz Nascimento, Maria Firmina dos Reis, Celso Paixão, que constroem, né, são essas mulheres, as mulheres negras que constroem um ponto de vista feminino negro e subalterno nas suas escritas. Conceição Evaristo, por exemplo.
So it's the Black women who construct their point of view in the subaltern literature.
Conceição Evaristo aponta para o necessário incômodo que a escrita de mulheres negras precisam provocar no interior da produção científica hegemônica.
So Conceição Evaristo points us towards the needed incômodo, the needed discomfort that Black women's production has to create within the scientific production, academic production.
Com uma virada epistêmica em que essa produção se insere no que ela chama de escrevivência.
So
A gente trouxe ontem no seu trabalho também.
She places this as an epistemic turn in what she calls escrevivência, which, how are we translating escrevivência?
Is writing with experience. Sorry, I translate like writing with experience because it's escribere, writing,
Yes.
and vivencia, que es la vivencia.
Yeah.
But we have talked about this yesterday, so don't worry. I think
No,
everybody
just-
I'm sorry, you weren't here. But it's that, it's
Yeah.
vivencia, which is a neologism from Portuguese, and it comes from the verb escrever, is writing, and vivencia, which is
The experience.
that experience.
So she puts them two into one.
Por isso um olhar de dentro, um olhar das próprias experiências.
And hence the internal look, looking to your own experiences.
Nesse livro, Becos da Memória, ela recupera a biografia de pessoas negras, principalmente de mulheres, a partir de uma análise que ela combina arquivos históricos,
So in this book, she's recuperating the experiences of Black women, coming from an analysis where she combines historical archives,
liberdade poética
the poetic license,
e crítica literária.
and literary criticism.
E também em dissonância com perspectivas hegemônicas da historiografia em seus estudos sobre política da memória nas narrativas da Revolução Haitiana. Revolução Haitiana de novo aqui.
So she's, and also a dissonance in narrating the experiences, a dissonance from the historical narrative in narrating the experiences of the Haitian Revolution.
O historiador Michael Trollo demonstra como que os relatos oficiais
Michel Tuyot and
demonstra como os relatos oficiais silenciam o passado por meio de algumas estratégias discursivas.
okay, so Michel Tuyot and in Silence in the Past, talking about the Haitian Revolution, talking about these particular discursive strategies in writing history, how they kind of reiterate certain silences,
Que promove determinados eventos enquanto invisibilizam outros.
which promote certain events while effacing others.
Ele introduz duas estratégias de narrar o passado. A primeira, a fórmula do apagamento,
So he introduces two strategies on narrating the past. One is the formula of erasure,
pelo qual se apaga um evento histórico, minimizando sua importância. Por exemplo, Revolução Haitiana é vista como uma revolta.
for instance, where you erase the importance, you erase an event by diminishing its importance, like the Haitian Revolution being seen as a revolt.
E a fórmula da banalização, pela qual se esvazia a importância de um evento particular
and the banalization formula by which you empty the importance of a particular event,
tirando todo o peso histórico.
removing a historical weight.
Bom, nesse sentido, a foto ausente de Aurora é uma metáfora das ausências múltiplas.
So in this sense, the absent picture of Aurora is a metaphor of the multiple absences.
Ancestralidades incertas, raízes rotas, identidades ambíguas.
Unsure ancestralities, rotten roots, the ambiguous identities.
E a Aurora tem uma tataraneta.
And Aurora
Ana
has
Clara.
a great-great-great-granddaughter.
Queremos crer que a Ana Clara tem os seus olhos. Ela tem 7 anos.
We like to believe that Ana Clara has her eyes. She's 7 years.
Sua mãe trabalha como empregada doméstica.
Her mom works in domestic work.
Sua mãe trabalha como empregada doméstica para uma família branca do Lago Sul.
Her mother works in domestic work for a white family in South Lake, which is a upper middle class suburb of Brasilia, the capital.
Como Pedro Paixão, que migrou para Salvador na década de 1990,
Just like Pedro Paixão, who migrated to Salvador in the decades of the 40s.
1990.
The 1990s.
A mãe de Ana deixou Celsa Paixão e foi tentar a vida na capital do país.
Ana's mother left Celso Paixão and went to the capital to try for a better life.
Os fios de memória se unem de maneira fatalmente íntima.
Memory threads unite in a way that is fatally intimate.
Qual o futuro reservado para Ana? Será diferente da existência de Aurora?
What does the future say for Ana? Will it be different from the life of Aurora?
Se a lógica da fungibilidade transforma todo e qualquer corpo negro em objeto de abuso coletivo atemporal, nos resta pensar nas possibilidades de reinvenção do presente.
If the logic of fungibility renders all black bodies as disposable, then we are left with wondering for the possibilities of the present.
Por meio do reclamo da vida e morte de Aurora como evento político.
By reclaiming Aurora's life and death as a political event.
Poderia a politização da sua existência reposicionar sua vida, a de Ana e a dos vencidos na pós-vida da escravidão?
Could the politicization of her life reposition her life, that of Anna's and of her descendants in the qual que é a última frase?
Na pós-vida da
In the
escravidão,
post-life of slavery.
lançados ao mar na travessia do Atlântico,
Launched to the seas in the Atlantic,
mortos nas
crossing,
plantações, mortos nas
dead in the
plantações,
plantations,
desaparecidos nas discussões policiais,
missing from the discussions of police,
humilhados nas cozinhas das casas grandes,
humiliated in the kitchens of big houses,
presos no sistema prisional,
incarcerated
como vidas vivíveis e mortes choradas.
as lives that are livable and deaths that you grieve over, that you cry over.
É isso, desculpa
That's
tanto
it.
tempo.
Thank you, Dina, for bringing not only your expertise but also your own personal experience into this event. As I mentioned, this final panel is precisely about moving beyond academia. Dina, muito obrigado por ter trazido não apenas a sua especialidade enquanto pesquisadora, mas fazer essa apresentação tão pessoal em uma mesa que tem exatamente o objetivo de ir muito além dos limites da academia. Muito obrigado.
Gracias por el coraje. Bravo.
whenever I'm talking with a new group of students, be it in the school, be it in the community, I sometimes open up with this story about a bear in this cage, and I'll open up this way. There's this traveling circus, and they have a bear inside of a 12-foot cage. And they had it since it was a cub, and they never let the bear out. They kept it in the cage, and every little town that they would go to, people would come and buy peanuts, and they'd throw peanuts into the cage and, whatever. Over time, the bear grows, gets big, and the people get uncomfortable with this. And they say, the bear roams the forest, hunts for her prey, and shouldn't be in that cage. So the people begin to organize and protest. And it starts out as just sort of this, they want to do some advocacy work. They want to get attention. And it soon turns into direct action, right? They organize protests. They're going to block roads, right? So they move from like writing petitions to like, we're going to try to get this bear out. The pressure's too much to bear. So this little traveling circus says, the bear's never been out of the cage. We can't just let it go. We'll find a zoo, and they find the local zoo. And says, we don't have a bear. Sure, we'll take the bear. And they build this fancy encampment with the little waterfall in the cave, and it's all decorative. And everybody's excited because the zoo has a new exhibit, and they start advertising. Come, you're gonna see the bear. The people get excited, the promotion, they're gonna. And you never guess what happened. The bear never left the cave. He stayed in. So they said, okay, well, we have a plan. We'll take the bear's food and we'll put it far away from the cave so that, it has to walk out. She's got to go and eat. A few more days pass. Still no bear. It doesn't leave. And now it's just they get in crisis mode. So let's take all of this stuff out. Just have an open space. Now the bear has to move about. They think the people are going to see him. And I say, you never guess what happens. The bear takes 12 steps, the exact dimensions of that cage, and at the 12th step, it pivots and walks back and forth. And then I asked my students, I said, what was the bear's problem? And I get a series of different answers. Well, it only ever lived in the cage and it didn't know how to. I said, but it wasn't in the cage anymore. It's had an open area that could have gone. I says, yeah, but I don't know. It just didn't. You get a series of answers, and I said, okay, well, what could they have done? Because they ended up just putting the bear down. But what could they have done instead of killing the bear? And it's, well, maybe if they put it with some other bears, and then you get around a range of things. And then after this discussion, we arrive at, what they get. But I want them to articulate what's happening. The bars that were on the outside of the bear had gotten inside of the bear's mind. And they were like, yeah, you couldn't see. And I was talking with this one student, and he says, this reminds me of this experiment that we talked about in one of my science classes. I forget the name of it, but it was like, they set these fleas and they put like a little saran wrap over a cup, and they would only, every time they jump, I'm sure you all remember this. And so then after so much time, they take the saran wrap and the fleas never jump any higher. And I says, aha, this is fascinating. I want to, at the point of that intersection, I want to read you a primary document that we talk about in the community when we talk not about the question of like, okay, and you set this up so perfectly, right? This idea of like Blackness is the problem, right? But the question of the how, right? The how did we get here? How do we do an intellectual genealogy on anti-Blackness as a white construction imposed 1703? This is right here. We in Rhode Island right now. We're gonna stay in Rhode Island. 1703, the transition was complete as the Rhode Island General Assembly wrote slavery and racism into the law. Now I make it the point to point out the date, right? Our students, they lose track of the date, and the dates are important to set the context. I said 1703. I said, when is the nation founded as the notion of a nation? You know, it's like, you know, the 4th of July, you know, we celebrate, and okay, so just, all right, okay, so we're way before then. Just want to get, okay, all right, so okay, cool. Let's come back now. And it quotes, if any Negroes or Indians, either freemen, servants, or slaves, do walk in the streets or in the streets of the town of Newport, that's a city here, or any other town in this colony after 9 o'clock of the night without a certificate from their masters, or some English person, it doesn't say white person, it says some English person of said family with them, because I want them to understand that whiteness is also a construction, or some lawful excuse for the same, that it shall be lawful for any person to take them up and deliver them to a constable. I did this with Mac before. And I say, okay, well, let's imagine that I'm out at 9:30 and I see you and I say, come on, let's go. I'm taking you to the constable. Because you don't have a white person with you. You're not supposed to be out here. You don't have any kind of pass. I said, there's going to be a problem. What's the obvious problem? She's going to say, what are you talking about? Clearly you haven't looked in the mirror lately. Both of us are in trouble. I say, aha. So if both of us are in trouble, does the 9 o'clock really make a difference? Right? Like if it's like 8:30, right? We're like, and you see the white folks and say, okay, but they're cool right now. But at 9 o'clock, we better either go get a pass or we got to get back home. And clearly not, right? When we fast forward that to the last iteration of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And what does that say? A federal agent traveling in the North can compel any white person to participate in the recapture of some slaves up over in the house up there in the attic. And it doesn't matter whether they're slave or free. Even if they got freedom papers, rip them up, throw them away. Why? Because there's compensation for their return to slavery. So it places a monetary value. What I try to do is to help folks begin to understand the way in which we ideologically track and trace the idea that the sociologists still clearly can't even get to today. And we could trace that right back here to Rhode Island. Prior to the American Revolution. The construction of race, the construction of Blackness as the problem, and by the problem, what I mean is the ways in which we think about Black bodies being created to attract violence, right? To draw violence. I was listening to your account and just feeling all of the intersects of like magnetic pulls of violence, right? To grandmother, to like so on and so forth. When we think about anti-Black violence and the purpose that it serves, and this is something that Frank Wilderson spent a lot of time talking about, right? This idea of the way in which it serves the psyche, right? The libidinal energy, right, of white civil society, or what I call white settler society. Right, we often talk about the space as if it is not still a settler colonial space. When we're in a community and we're organizing, one of the ideological platforms that I ground as deeply in the ground as I can, I says, here in the United States, we did not have slavery. We had something called chattel slavery. Chattel is a legal term that comes over from British law, and it literally means private movable property. How do we understand our economic value in a capitalist system today? Through a number. It goes as high as 850, and if it drops below 500, ain't no creditor talking to you. It's the credit score. Don't matter. But they don't have this number in a chattel slave system. The notion that you can turn a human being into a living, movable asset in a legal construction, in an economic construction, that a creditor can now track and trace economic value on, not just to the Black person, but to the white person. You see? We understand now the way in which wealth is moving in the society. So if you are a chattel slave, and that's an economic term, not associated with a human being, what possibilities does that create? What can you do? Well, if we're talking in a plantation system, you can. In this room right now, and I use this example all the time, we all have things on the desk that are our private property. But not all of it is our chattel. Okay, if you have a bottle of water, you've been drinking it, it's your private property, but it's not chattel. In order for it to be chattel, it has to hold economic value in a marketplace. You can't sell a bottle of water, but the phone, somebody might buy that. Well, that means you can take out insurance policies on it. You can give it as a gift. Here's the dilemma. That thing, right, the human that you've turned into the thing can escape. They can decide to leave. They can fight back. They can resist. They can burn it all down in Haiti. Like literally. This is the problem. Sylvia Winter talks about the paternal father, right? This idea of the paternal father in my favorite piece that she writes, Sambos and Minstrels. She says there are two stereotypes which will emerge for the white paternal father. One is the Sambo, the blackface Sambo. But Sambo's not real. He's like literally a social construction, right? He lives only in the ideas of the white settler society. But then she says you also have the Nat. And who is Nat? Nat is a slave who kills his master, launches the most frightening slave rebellion in U.S. history, not in terms of its scale, but in terms of its memory. What does the Nat Turner Rebellion remind the planter class of? It makes them think that there just might be another Haitian revolution a little further north. Nat must be eliminated. Nat must be eliminated. And so at the close of the American Civil War, there, in the removal of the plantation notwithstanding convict leasing systems, there must emerge a now more formal state carceral system to meet this need. You must eliminate the Nat. He's a literal threat. And you must maintain the image of the Sambo. Sambo is happy. Sambo has no problems. Sambo is obedient. Sambo's not intelligent. Sambo doesn't think. Sambo just dances. He does whatever you say. In fact, Sambo loves it. He loves to perform for his white master. Nat, you got to watch out for Nat, because he has a special skill. Nat is illiterate. He can read. And he uses as his text the Bible. So now you have the introduction of the biblical message, this notion of the Christian message. We can, Nat says it's a powerful weapon. He begins to preach a different message. He says, okay, I think I know who Pharaoh is now, right? This is the same thing Malcolm X said. He says, listen, the white man doesn't want me in their military, because Malcolm X said they were afraid he'd already know who to shoot at. You see. When we think about the legal construction of race, legal construction of anti-Black violence, white supremacy, and its need to absorb anti-Black violence to reorient itself. The field can't sustain that, right? So it has to push those scholars out. It can't really take Du Bois serious. because there's an implication there. The structure, the machine, the system needs to not actually see, right, your grandmother, your grandfather. There's a way in which the machine needs to not actually see Blackness. And so it has to create these structures of kinds of sambos and adjust their proximity to whiteness. That's how this system measures this notion of safety. I wanted us to think about what it means to do or not do, but not just do the intellectual work, but what the intellectual work looks like and feels like on the ground outside of the space. I often, when I'm at some kind of book talk, a standard question that I'll ask other scholars is, how do you imagine folks using your work and your scholarship outside of here, right? And a lot of times, like, I'll do a book reading, like a book talk that's not on a campus, right? We'll do it out in the community with folks who would never set foot on Brown many times, right? Folks who are formerly incarcerated, right? And they're gonna pick up the book. I'm like, I don't know what half these words mean. Like, what's the point? What are you saying? Like, let's just talk about what's really going on. And one of the struggles and the challenges with that is trying to figure out how these spaces not like talk to each other, but how they use each other, right, to get at the actual project of liberation, right? And when I say liberation, like what I'm talking about, like, is Black liberation, right? There's the Haitian Revolution, but I was thinking about when Bose was talking today, and I always like think about like, well, what was that like if you're there in 1795? Like what, you know what I'm saying? And I really appreciated what it was saying. Like, how do we, like, what might it mean, right, for you to say to these other folks in these departments and these disciplines, sometimes we don't even want you there, but like, no, like, we're gonna have like a real conversation. What happens when we actually do have to see? And I love that you had the picture of the, what's that? The little girl.
Oh, the little girl. Yeah, I think it's her niece. Ana é sua sobrinha, né?
Ana, sua sobrinha.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's her niece.
It's her niece. Because we will never be able to unsee her, right? She will never be hidden. And what happens, right? And this is through, like, it sounds like one of your life projects. What happens when we make the academy see? Not just see through the book, but see through the book. You see? I close with this, with saying, like, that's the general moment of what it means to imagine this new world, right? To be on the ground in the revolution, to be creative, to have to think. It's no mistake that Haitian artists give to the world what they give to the world. Can you imagine their creative energy? The same with Brazil. The creative energy that have come out of these Black spaces. Clearly sociality didn't want to have to create, right? As has been said, revolution is not just about like what we burn down, but what we build, and we have to be the most creative in the revolution. Thank you.
I truly appreciate the contributions that all of you brought today, different types of contribution according to your experiences as scholars, as activists, and from your personal lives. Before we begin a larger conversation, I'll be very honest. I thought of this panel to make all of us uncomfortable. I mentioned this to Marco, I think. Because I think it is very easy to organize academic events following a protocol, and there is an expectation about how performances and questions and the conversation is going to develop. Sometimes people fight a little bit, but it's still performatic. And I'm a scholar trying to think about regimes of racial violence, criminal justice systems in the Americas. And it's very easy to transform this topic into an object. And I'm just observing as a scientist and trying to create explanations about this phenomenon. And to be very honest, I think I was trained like this at first in law school, later history school, social sciences school. And when I thought of studying violence, it began, and this is directly connected to what Nicole brought today. I was studying slavery, taking one class and taking another class about the sociology of punishment, reading David Garland. And I was like, hey, there's something here, how can we build these connections? But I was thinking as a very young student, trying to understand theory, how that applies to a certain object, building interpretations. But it's easy to be a white student at the University of São Paulo, becoming a white historian and using this as a topic. But the closer I got to my subject, the more I realized this was actually, I wasn't studying Brazilian past, I was actually seeing the everyday life of people in Brazil, especially people of African descent, as a consequence of what I was seeing in class. And I keep pushing myself to read, to learn from experiences that are far beyond academia, because that always makes me uncomfortable about the position that I'm occupying, what I'm writing. And I believe this panel works perfectly because it shows the limits of what I do as a scholar, and this is not only personal, I'm thinking about all that we do. So the first thing I have to say is that I have much more to learn from you today than anything else to say. I will present just one question, one comment, just to begin this conversation. But honestly, the panel is done. And you did a wonderful work. And I'm pretty sure that the discussion that my colleagues might bring here will be much more interesting than anything I can bring. I'll present just a comment to Nicole and a question. As I mentioned, when I started thinking about, hey, I'm studying criminal justice system, state violence, death penalty, racial violence, that was my final step. I started by studying David Garland, I started by studying Michel Foucault, and I was trying to understand the making of these criminal justice systems and this history, not only sociology, but also the history of punishment and legal punishment, later extra-legal punishment. But then I was studying slavery, so then I needed to understand the implications of this phenomenon in a slave society. But then I realized it's not only about slavery, it's actually about race. So then I started studying the sociology of race relations in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I love the fact that Du Bois was the one who brought you the answers, because in my case, it was especially Brazilian scholars, most of them Afro-Brazilian scholars who studied race relations in Brazil. And this was the way I started connecting the dots. But the fact that we are discussing punishment and violence, and this was not obvious for people who study these topics in Latin America, this is crazy. Because when we talk about punishment and violence, we are especially talking about people of African descent as the main victims. So the fact that you had to build these connections, and I had to build these connections in Brazil, this is insane. Because it shows how these departments are segregated, and we're not seeing what is obvious. We're segregating topics when in society they're not separated. It's obvious that any study about violence and punishment should begin by discussing race in the Americas, not only in Latin America. And your paper is very interesting because you bring like this criminology of Black criminality, and then the possibility of Black criminology, like Black scholars developing this criminology, but then you bring something else. Let's theorize racial punishment. So it's not about who's the scholar, not necessarily about who's the perpetrator or the victim, but let's understand that the making of punishment as an institution in the societies, it was racialized from the beginning. And I think this is very important because many scholars and political activists nowadays, they will say, yes, this criminal justice system, they're not colorblind, they are racist, or the kind of violence they perpetrate is racially motivated. Yes, this is a very important statement, but I think it's more than that. Like what I'm trying to do in my research, and this is the advantage of being a historian, I'm analyzing the making of modern criminal justice systems in the late 18th century, early 19th century Atlantic world, and saying, these institutions, they haven't been built as colorblind institutions and they became racist, or they could have been racist according to certain people. Racism was fundamental in the making of criminal justice systems.
That's right.
So every single legal institution that was imagined in the early 19th century, it was not imagined only thinking about abstract citizens. It was created specially to preserve social hierarchies, racial order. So I believe you agree with me, but I've been pushing you to think like, we're not only talking about the fact that these institutions pretend to be colorblind, but they are racist. They were built as racist institutions from the beginning, and one of the main goals was to preserve racial order. And this is like the same of discussing, like people talk about capitalism. Capitalism is not necessarily racist. Perhaps it was connected to slavery in the past, but this is writing another history of capitalism, because historical capitalism was racist from the beginning. And I think the same statement applies to criminal justice systems. We might imagine how they could look if they were colorblind institutions based on liberal principles. But in fact, they were built, developed, and they function as racist institutions. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this. And I think this is connected to what Marco brought. We're thinking about, you mentioned net, like the racial stereotype of net. And like, especially in the aftermath of emancipation, especially after the Civil War. Okay, the plantation, slavery, black codes, legal codes, those were institutions that were fundamental to preserve the slave order. And in the aftermath of emancipation, there were so many nets during the Civil War. How can they reestablish not slave order, but a racial order based on new institutions? We brought convict-based systems. We could talk about prison farms, and then why not police institutions, mass incarcerations? So I think like it is fundamental to think about all of this, the making and remaking of these institutions and these regimes of violence in the age of slavery, in the aftermath of emancipation, and how they're always connected to the preservation of slave order and racial order. And finally, like your comment about thinking about, yes, like I'm trying to do this research, it might become a book one day. And what is the point? Should I put this on my CV? Why am I writing this? Who am I writing this to? And I'm seriously thinking like, okay, I might write a book, but how can we turn this into an instrument? Not of curiosity of people who want to understand the history of this process, but those who could actually turn history and knowledge into a political instrument to change something in the present. This is my challenge. I haven't solved. And I brought you here today, perhaps because you could teach me. and you could offer me solutions so that I could go beyond what my academic training was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Do we respond or do we?
Like, I'm not the leader anymore. I think I never was. I'm never.
Well, I'll just make a couple comments about, right now my latest work that I'm doing another book on, this is about wrongful conviction, and it's called Crime Fictions, the racist lies that police tell. And it just takes I didn't think it would take a historical look, but it basically takes a historical look looking at George Stinney, who was he was a Black child to be executed in America at 12 years old in the 1940s. And they put him on a stack of Bibles because he was too small for the electric chair. And in this case, to your point about, these were institutions built they were built by racism for racist intent. So I use what my friend Brittany Friedman calls racist intent, which is we need to name the intentionality of the systems itself, because that's another issue, which is, oh, we didn't mean to do it. No, you did. And at the time of the 1940s, there was a struggle about who controlled justice. If you were to live in the South in the 1940s, justice was a lynch mob. And likewise, at this time, the courts in the 1920s were wrangling due process and trying to eliminate mob rule from these courts and say, no, South, it has to be much more dignified than that. And it was about appearances. It wasn't about substance. You have the Scottsboro Boys, you have all these terrible incidents where you could just point a finger at a Black person and that was it. You didn't need evidence. All of this is just a big sham, really. And so with the Stinney trial, they were protecting him from lynching, but they put the lynch mob in the jury. Mm-hmm. White women walked into that court because their husbands were frisked, so they didn't want mob rule, but the white women had guns in their purses, so that if he happened to be found not guilty, they were going to shoot that little boy. Mm-hmm. They imagined George Stinney with maroon eyes. They said his eye color was maroon. Who has maroon eyes except within that racial imagination of a tiny man, right? A tiny. Now I use the two tropes being the mope trope and the monster trope, these two parallels. One is the mope, who is a socially degenerate figure. It's what attorneys actually use. They say that word in lieu of saying the N-word because they can't, and that's unsavory. So they created their own word. But they do call defendants monsters. And they use that term and they feel that, it's like where the criminal distinctions collide with these racial distinctions, as I wrote in Crook County, and it allows white attorneys to talk in overtly racist ways under the guise of, we're just doing criminal justice work, we're just doing legal work. So I'm there with you, and I think we have to name the thing a thing, but I also think, to me, this is almost me stepping back in time. Like, I was already there. I just felt like it was an injustice not to say that Du Bois was really there first. You know what I'm saying? Ida B. Wells, she was there first. She was there first. Du Bois was there first. Other Black criminologists there first. So I felt like there has to be some type of, Marcus Hunter calls it academic reparations. There's a lot of Black scholars that need some reparations. They need some citations. There's some that were chased out of the department. There's no amount of citations that can fix that, right? They're not here with us at Brown. I've integrated 3 departments, and I'm in my mid 40s, and I haven't been a professor that long. I got my PhD in 2011. So Temple, I was the first person of color to be hired. I think at University of Delaware, same thing, and then at Brown. And I think that in and of itself, I just owe an enormous amount of debt to Black scholars. When I had no home, they made me a home. And it wasn't in sociology, it was the ECRT scholars. It was the critical race scholars, like Osagie Basogi and Dorothy Roberts and Paul Butler and Laura Gomez. And it was mostly Black scholars, some Latinx scholars. But without that, I think sociology would have crushed this work. And there wouldn't have been a space. And it was only after tenure that I could write this. But Crook County was also a scathing indictment of, sociology and criminology. So, there's payback when some of that stuff happens. Yeah. So, yeah, to your point, yes. And I want to even add the word racist intent because I think it is important to name the actors, you know? I mean, I almost wonder too sometimes, and maybe historians can help me out, we see a ton of white violence. Like I was looking at old footage of, they threw rocks at Martin Luther King when he came to Chicago. You know, and he has this great quote. He's like, I've seen many racist places in the world, Mississippi, Alabama. He's like, but I've never seen a place as racist as Chicago. And the North always prides itself as being better than, as though they weren't participating in racial violence. And I was wondering, like, whose grandma is that? Can we name those people? I mean, seriously, is there any can we get Henry Louis Gates to do here's your ancestors for white people? No, and I'm not joking. It's not a joke. That's your grandma. That's your great grandma. Yeah. She did that. Just, and she did that. But she also cooked great mac and cheese. But both things can be possible, and she wasn't benevolent, and she inflicted racial violence on people. We can name them right there. So I almost think that racist intent should be part of it's not just reparations, but reparations means naming perpetrators too.
Of course.
But that's my feeling. But yeah, come in there.
Marco, Jean, if you have any comments, but I think my colleagues also have things to say. I know what Dr. wants to say.
Yeah, but please.
No, go ahead.
Well, I have several. First, I have this sensation. So for me, it probably is even more complicated than for you. It's not actually that complicated. It's just probably painful in the sense that I am a person of color. I'm Black, Cuban, and also even And why do I say that I'm Cuban? Is also because I know the inequalities within the United States, but we cannot forget that the United States, the reality of the United States is completely different to one Brazil, and Cuba, etc. So, and I work, I work right now at Penn, so I am in the academia, under the academy. And my thing is, so I'm not conflicted with that because I own this, so my ancestors built everything around. So, but the problem is that we tend to forget that the academy and everything, everywhere, the family, the conception of family, the conception of everything is within, again, this epistemology that we are. So at the very end, this is what remains, which means that we are addressing in any of our discourses structural racism. And I know that we all agree with that, so this is not the question. But I want to start by that because my actual question is, how do you, especially not that much Tina, but somehow, but how do you implement all your findings? How do you implement, in the case of specifically of the analysis of the judiciary racism? Of course, we agree with everything that you have said, but how, for instance, do we find those proofs of and we present? I'm talking really in the court and everything. How do we present the proofs of this structural racism? Or how do we do it within the same system? That actually, that's why for me it's a little bit that, well, there is no, sometimes we think that there is no, this is Afro-pessimism, in the sense that sometimes we think there is no way out, because how do you present or say the proofs of this structural racism to the same institution that whose very reason d'être is to not only to enforce this structural racism. So it's almost impossible. I'm not saying it is impossible, but I'm saying it's probably so. I feel like, and then it's related to your question. So how our discussions, how do we imagine, you ask us, how do we imagine our work out of the academia and the academy? And the fact is the academy is part of this, as much as the judiciary system, we are within, and we are working within a structure that is within this, enforcing this structural racism. So sometimes I wonder if the question wouldn't have been how to make these reparations, for instance, from which we need. I understand, I feel every word you are saying. You can probably imagine. But constantly, every day, at any minute, everywhere. Okay, so yes, we probably need the reparations, but the reparations to keep the same knowledge within the same institution that enforces this structural racism. So this is where I get lost. I don't know how you're, and yes. I don't know how you see
I
that.
have an answer, but you can
I
take
know
it
it's
and
kind
I
of
can
a
go.
revolution that I
No,
am
I can-
proposing, but explosion. But
Take care. I'm thinking of two things to your powerful question. One is when I think about the creative moment, and Mac, I think you and I, we started this kind of conversation. Something happens when you introduce truth, and by truth I don't mean facts, right? When you introduce truth into a space that disrupts the linearity of lives.
and what happens? What is that? What happens? I am a writer as well.
Yes.
So yes. So tell me what happens when we introduce our tools, like for instance, like Dina or any of the writers
Yes.
she was talking about, and I was talking yesterday when we introduced this this experience, our experiences actually within those discourses that constantly deny ours. So my question is, what does happen? What is that something that happens, and what is the real impact of this? Sorry that I
No, this is perfect. I have an 8-year-old niece, and I give her paint and I give her a blank canvas, and we never have a discussion about what we want to paint. I leave it wide open, and we talk about the process as we're painting together of what it's becoming, right? Revolutions, right, force these terms, and I believe that when you bring truth, right, like I hear in your work, you're gonna know, like I will never forget your grandmother, and I've never seen her either, right? Like something happens in that space that starts to create something, and what I'm saying is I don't think we always know the answer to that question so much as that we know that like it changes, right? This idea of like colonialism is a kind of silence.
silencing.
It's a silence.
Process of silence.
It's the process of silencing. And so bringing truth, it disrupts that linearity. That's what I'm saying, right? And so by now, truth like makes things live, right? And this is, but we don't always fully know what the freedom or the liberation is going to look like, particularly in an anti-Black world now that's centuries old. You know what I mean? And so we talk about this in like Afrofuturistic terms, but like, I mean, this is bananas to think about. All of us sitting in this room right now, we work on this stuff. We get paid to work on this stuff. Some more than others. This is like our job. Right? Like this is like our full-time job. Like we don't work at McDonald's. Our full-time job is to do this stuff. And if somebody asks us, can you tell me what Black freedom actually looks like. And we'll be sitting here scratching our heads like, well, right? You spent your life career looking at Colombia and Cuba.
But I actually could answer what, and it's actually not being first. There is not such a black freedom, because the freedom will actually, from my point of view, come from the moment in which we are not black anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And first it starts, of course, for us, but we are constantly, and I understand your
Yeah.
point. I am a writer, I am a professor, I do this all the time.
Yeah.
I advance my own scholarship because of the work that all the others have done. I am not saying it's useless. I am saying, until what point we have to always remember that this is structural, that we are working within these institutions, that we are using their tools, not just the computer,
Yeah.
the language.
Yes.
You know, and this is just not saying, let's not do anything, because
Right.
no, this is not, it's just this understanding. And just through this understanding, I wonder, that's why, especially concerning the UDCR. So how? Because it's beautiful what you. So how you just put it there for us. Problem. The problem is that there is no racism, because this is how it is built. The justice system. This is how it is built. Only if you have proof, there is racism. So how do we prove?
Yeah.
In court.
Well, I can
Not
I
here.
can speak to that. So I'll just quickly I remember having to read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend Victor Rios is an ethnographer. He embeds in different field sites, etc. And he calls white ethnographers doing jungle trope ethnography, where they're embedding in a social situation and they're making Black, brown communities look dysfunctional the same way. It's a very colonial gaze. And one of the things I wanted to do in my work is, what if I gazed at white people in the same way? What if I was the Heart of Darkness and I went native? And by native, I mean I went alongside the white people to see them. And so one of the things that I play around with is my own racial identity. As a light-skinned Chicana, I can do that. My married name is Van Cleve. They don't know I'm Gonzalez, right? They don't know I'm Jenny from the block. So I go in there and I'm like, when they say to me, let me tell you about these black people. Let me tell you about the scum we deal with. I'm like, tell me about the scum that you deal with. That sounds terrible. Mm-hmm. And they tell me everything they want to say if they think a person of color is not in the room. So that was the beginning of my research. And so the way I'm an empiricist, and critical race scholars would say, we don't need data to prove how people of color, Black people in particular, experience prejudice and power. That should be enough. We should just believe Black people when they tell you it's violent. We can see it with our own eyes. Like, don't tell me we need more data on this. That's my biggest pet peeve. But in terms of the currency of where we work, I have to show you data for you to believe. Yeah. You, ustedes, everybody, I have to show, right? So for me, I overload people with data. So the ethnography, but is that good enough? No, because I am still a person of color. Who's gonna believe one person? Because it's still not good enough. I could be there for a decade, which is what I did, but it's not good enough. 100 interviews. I then brought in 150 different researchers of different backgrounds. So they looked on the same courtrooms in the largest urban jurisdiction, 25 courtrooms. So I had amassed an additional 1,000 hours of data. So the book has so much data on it. It was, I don't even think it was necessary, but it was to kind of prove racism, right? And so when that came out, the Department of Justice did a similar study showing everything showing the same things, pattern practices. And so So the results was that when the book came out, it was right at the time that Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times. There was a cover-up. And it seemed as though they were just going to get away with it. And so we had Black Lives Matter protesting in the streets, doing the heaviest burden of the work of activism. But I came out against the prosecutor and said they know about these cover-ups because I had all this data. and they believed it, and then the chief prosecutor lost her job. It helped oust the existing prosecutor. Only 2 prosecutors were ousted in the US. So I don't know if it helps, but now it seems like a currency that people can say racism in a way we couldn't say racism before in 2015. If you wrote a book with the title racism in it, that's a book that would have been banned or marginalized, but that is a ton of work. I mean, it shouldn't have to be that way. I don't agree with it, but it's what we have to do. You know, same with this next book. I'm gonna call police liars. I have a lot of evidence that they're lying. They're fabricating cases. I'm gonna have to mobilize a ton of evidence for people to believe me, right? So it's a disproportionate burden of truth. Does that make sense? But I don't know. I mean, again, it's.
I'm listening to
This is debatable, yeah, I mean.
No, and I'm thinking about the work of Ida B. Wells. Like,
Yes,
talk about
how much
data.
work did she have to do
Yeah.
to show? But the thing is, if you asked any black person in the South,
They do.
they knew why wasn't it enough, right? It's whose word mattered, and whose word mattered is largely constructed by race and
Because
racism.
it's a system. So what about this trying to? I'm wondering. Maybe, of course, not all maybe, but completely agreement. What about just completely disregarding the question of I want to be believed and just disregarding the system itself? I know it's absolutely utopian, but just thinking, because at the very end we are asking somewhere, either in academy or a dean or somebody or president or the tenure committee, or and I am not, of course, I am not saying no. I have my job. I am clear with that. I'm not saying, let's go now to make the revolution outside. Just doing it. Again, probably this part of the Afrofuturism that you are talking about. But what about just disregarding everything? Disregarding this, because we knew all the time. We knew from yesterday. The woman that I forgot her name, George, and your talk. She said. They didn't need prisons. Our prison was the white man. Punto. No más. Ya, suficiente. Okay, and this was, I am not sure, she was a slave?
Yeah.
She was, yeah. So, and everybody knows, okay? But the problem is that we keep still believing that we have to be believed, or we have to convince some committee or somewhere because we are within those institutions, still somehow trusting the very same institutions that ultimately are constantly playing with us. And so all the conversations, all our discussions are at the very end, they are playing with it. But it's probably Friday night, the end of the semester. I have said I am too tired. I am not in those disciplines, so I probably can't dream. And but that's why I was curious with that, because I know I'm a dreamer, I think everything I'm a writer, but that's why I brought the question to people like you that are really know what the actual
I
facts.
identify as a writer now. Just quickly answer your question, but I identify as a writer as well. I'm a creative nonfiction writer, but I'm also a sociologist and empiricist. So different than a journalist, I'm maybe like Ida B. Wells, I'm just mobilizing a ton. Like, I'm not just saying this, I'm saying it because I have, I built this upon so many different cases. But I always say, I'm making people see. I can't, like we just said, we can't unsee that little girl. We see her, we see Aurora, we see, right? And one of the things that I say is, I will not allow white people to say they have not seen, right? To say they, and if they choose to see,
That's right.
and they choose the same choice, then I see them.
This
I see them. That's okay.
Okay.
I mean, it's not okay, but in the trial of Derek Chauvin, one of the things that had shifted, and I remember talking to the Washington Post about this, it used to be very easy for police attorneys to seek jurors that believed wholeheartedly, blindly in police. This time they couldn't.
Yeah.
And that was because there was a lot of activists and a lot of people like me saying police are overtly racist. They have been. There's a history, and you need to question them like you would any witness. Mostly that's for white people. That's not for people of color that have been profiled.
It was the film.
Right. Right, and there's film. And now they see. But it's amazing because the prosecutor in that case said, I don't see a murder of George Floyd. I see some violence, but I don't see a murder. So I thought that was so powerful because it was like so evident that through his white lens and his proximity to police, his allegiance, he could not see murder when everyone else was.
I see.
Right.
Now,
that's how I feel.
Yes,
That's how I feel, and it is a choice. It is a choice, and they're choosing violence, but I know exactly who those people are, right? And
I love.
I don't know if that's
now it's great.
Is that better?
No, not better. This is
I passed.
This is really what I was. No, I'm sorry. I didn't.
I'm teasing. It's a
But I was in the beginning. I was like, yeah, we need a material.
It's true.
I was like, but now, yes, I would. What you say? I will not allow these white people to.
Don't say you didn't know. Don't say that's a lie.
Yeah.
So
That's the lie.
Yeah, this is a great.
Or whatever.
strategy,
I use the theoretical term in my book, sincere fictions. It's not that they're lying. It's they truly have internalized through whiteness, through their power that they don't know or they don't see. It's like a denial, and so it's a sincere fiction. They're claiming that they didn't know.
Yeah,
But now they can't claim that.
No, because if they say it's clear, it's part of their not even white supremacy, it's their privilege. If
It's
they
a privilege to not
say,
see.
I do see it, if they say from there, or not forced by a powerful, a powerhouse like you, but if from themselves, they are not going to say, I do see it, because this is giving us some of their privilege, or the fundament of their privilege. So, and I stop talking now. I get into my.
I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned that I think is very important, is why is it that we silence the fact that pseudoscience was racist from the mid-19th century to the 1930s. And for Latin America, it's even worse now because there was very little kind of opposition to that. And I might be a little provocative, but I wonder to some extent if Marxism didn't contribute to that.
Of course.
Because with the emphasis on race, on class, they denied completely the racial issue. Even slavery was a question of class. And in the US, I wonder how much, because of the Cold War, the thing about Marxism became a sort of, being in a position to the installed power. And so it had more force. And a lot of scholars got into that to sort of ignore the issue of race for quite a while, especially regarding Latin America. So and I think really if in any kind of classes, sociology, criminology, we did some history of what that pseudoscience was until recently, I mean, that would be honest with quotation. That will reopen eyes of people.
I thought you were going to say eugenics movements. I thought you were going to say eugenicists.
Yes.
So here's the one thing I say, and it's funny because
same thing.
there was a big debate by the editors in this Du Bois volume. So the accepted science of Du Bois's time, eugenics.
Yes.
And so there is this
the
quote.
whole immigration policy to Latin America. It was huge. It was whitening, and it was the words that were used. Blanquear la nación.
The whitening of the nation.
Yes. And there was the words, and even the Mexican Revolution.
Yes.
Welcomed refugees from the Spanish Civil War because it would contribute to whiten the nation. And at the same time, they attempted to prohibit marriage of indigenous people. To encourage white indigenous women to marry non-indigenous person. That's the first thing that I wanted to say. But
Well, I just want to respond to this really quickly. But here's something that Du Bois wrote, and this is painful to accept because I was shocked when I saw that he published with Sanger in the Birth Control Review, and he says that he argued that birth control for poor African Americans was necessary for the race, and that people, quote, must learn among the human races and groups, as among vegetables, quality and not mere quantity really counts. Du Bois said that. So he was all about the eugenicist movement, but
it's advancement.
But again, it was the advancement, and it's funny, like, we can all, and I think it's just powerful because we too can appropriate, you know, who he was in 1932 was not who he was
Right.
when he passed.
Absolutely.
We can evolve, you know, so we can all change, we can appropriate new
And it was the
ideas.
framework of his time. It was the
It was,
idea of
it was the
progress.
accepted science.
Yeah,
How could he
that's
learn
it.
to be in an academia, like to the original point, like how could he be in an institution and learn
Yeah.
data collection and analysis without
And
being
I just
trained
would
by
like to add
eugenics.
something about
Yeah.
the Haitian Revolution and the work by Antonin Firmin,
Yeah.
who wrote this long, I mean, it's 40-something, 30 pages essay. It's called about the equality of races, and it's a refutation yes, the German,
Can't think of his name.
yeah,
Yeah, the anthropologist. Yeah.
the worst racist
Yeah.
writers at the time. De l'inégalité des races, the inequality of races. What's his name? He was sometime in Brazil.
You're
Anyway,
talking about Spencer, right?
huh?
It's not Spencer, right?
No, it's,
No.
forgetting his name. I know you're talking because that book is not for Mon. What? How do you say his name again?
Antenor Firmin.
Firmin. Yeah.
And
It's
it's
way underread. It should be
yeah, and it was
widely
first
read.
published and translated and published in the US in the
Yeah.
1990s.
Yep.
And in France later on. But anyway, it shows you, I mean, the whole book is a defense of the Haitian Revolution. It shows that Black people can be as equal to any others in Haiti because they had their revolutions. But he goes through, I mean, it's 400, all the different methods that were used by racist thinkers at the time. It's
Yeah.
fascinating
Yeah.
to see. And the other thing that I wanted just to point out is that I think also in this, what you were saying, you know, this how to change things, it's also important to focus, it's happening now, but on white privilege. Because that unstabilizes the whole thing. Because it points at the privilege, at how it's constructed, and also, I mean, how it contributes to the structures up to today, and it put them on the defensive with this whole idea of meritocracy. And I think really it's a good tool to sort of unstabilize the system.
No.
Me parece que essa questão da academia que está se fazendo uma crítica aqui,
I think this whole matter about academia and the critiques in academia that have been presented here.
o racismo, né, estruturado nas instituições, seja na academia, seja no judiciário. E hoje a gente tem uma discussão muito popularizada no ativismo, e não só no ativismo, mas também vamos pensar numa esquerda como algo mais amplo.
So if we think about like structural racism and institutional racism, this has been developed
De que
and beyond academia, including like political activists and society nowadays.
de que se as pessoas negras ocuparem espaços de poder, esses espaços irão mudar, e a gente observa que não é bem isso que acontece, porque a gente teve o assassinato da Marielle, que era uma parlamentar,
So
uma
she's
mulher que
mentioning
estava na
that
instituição.
like we might think that if people of African descent occupy positions within this institution, things will change. But then she's mentioning the case of Marielle Franco, who was like a politician. She was the most voted deputy in Rio de Janeiro, and she was still murdered.
O que eu estou tentando refletir aqui é sobre os limites mesmo, tanto os limites em termos de ativismo político, quanto os limites em termos de produção acadêmica para pessoas negras que conseguem acessar esses espaços, né, conseguem entrar na academia, por exemplo, para fazer uma pesquisa, mas o quanto que a nossa vida, né, não sei se eu posso falar a nossa vida no contexto de violência, de genocídio, se é de fato considerada, né, para ter que provar em sociedades legalistas do direito, como as nossas, as Américas, as sociedades que são fundadas na diáspora negra, na escravidão, o quanto que falando do poder judiciário, por exemplo, o quanto que não vale a prova, porque o ser negro está totalmente fora da sociedade legalista do direito, está fora da ideia do direito. Eu como advogada, desculpa.
So she's mentioning that even occupying these institutions, like participating on the institutions, does it really change the fact that Black lives are treated differently in these societies? Does it really change the fact that, talking about fungibility as she mentioned during her presentation, are we actually changing anything in terms of structures and institutions to the point that even by being activists within the judiciary, does it make a difference?
I think. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you still? No, I think one of the things that changes is the ability for the machine to function in the way that it previously functioned, right? I think part of the change happens that way, right? The fact that now your work can be used, right, to be like, no, that thing doesn't operate that way.
You said, yeah.
It never really did, but like for them, yeah, it doesn't operate that way. And so now the machine has to function differently. I often use the example of Harriet Tubman, right? In no moment whenever she's escaped or any slave escapes the plantation, do they imagine that the entire plantation structure is come down, right? But they have this space of freedom in a larger context. And so, but the collection of that, right, is somebody, use the example, it may not necessarily be the one bee sting that gets you, right? But if the whole swarm shows up. So I think this is the ways that as a martial artist, teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I tell my students, you have to, when you're thinking about moving someone off their base, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we train to fight on the ground. And so when you're thinking about moving somebody off their base, you have to corrupt their posture, right? So you have to take their post away, right? You have to pull it, and then it starts to corrupt the posture. How do we corrupt the posture or white supremacy? Not just in the legal structures, but in the ideation and ideas, right? And this is, again, what I love about y'all's work. You're no, you're not finna, I don't even care if we have a picture, you're not about to forget my grandmother. Because I'm gonna show you my niece, I'm gonna draw the line, right? In your work, you're not gonna get ready to just act like this ain't. Oh, you want some data? I'll give you 2 books of data. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? So part of it is just making the machine not to work. Yes.
No,
sometimes you're a slave on a plantation. You might not get free, but you can bring some tools. You know what I'm saying? You can the labor organize, say, all right, listen, we're gonna make no more water bottles. We're gonna slow it down. We make 100 today. We're gonna make 3. Because we're still humans, right? And I hear this in your questions starting out how do we breathe? How do we live? You're saying you're a writer, but sometimes it's hard to write. We gotta eat, we gotta live, we gotta love, we gotta sleep, we gotta be human at the same time. That you know what I mean? Yeah. While we trying to talk about freedom, Mac and I was walking over, and he's like, "I'm traveling over here, and I'm driving to Virginia, and I'm flying to Canada. I don't know where in the hell he's going. He's just going everywhere." But we trying to live, and so we kind of still on a plantation of sorts, right? We trying to live out here. That's how we say in the street. When people come into the door at the organization saying my license got cut off, I'm dealing with this, my son is over here, the police chasing it. Can you help me? Can y'all help us? And you know what we tell them? We don't know. We don't have the answers. But together, We get together, we're gonna figure it out. We talk to lawyers, we do this, we do that. And that's organizing. But it comes down to like we're trying to figure out how to live. You can't vote either, I can't vote, you can't vote, you can't vote. All right, let's get together. Let's do a test run, somebody go register. And if you lose your job, you can come stay with me. I'm gonna make sure you eat. We don't do that no more enough. We need to get back to some of that. I think they do it in Brazil though. It sounds like y'all do it in Brazil.
I'm going to take advantage and I would like just to ask a question from a European perspective. How does the new legislation that is approved in Texas and Florida against teaching Black history in public school, how is this affecting you and the teaching of Black studies in the university in general in the United States? It's something
I don't even listen to that. We don't even listen to that shit.
We already to that. That's the question I had. I thought, Marco, you did an excellent job of giving an example. But, I know we're at Brown University, so it's a different clientele than maybe University of Florida or
Texas.
Schools
Go
in Texas.
Texas.
But, Nicole, you were saying that, these ideas are radical, not for us, but for many outside of this building.
Yeah.
I see my I don't say activism, but actualist, right? To tell these stories, to disrupt with truth, through education, through the teaching.
That's right.
So how do you impart these radical ideas to students? Because that's what it seems like the change. So I'm asking personally, so I can know how to do this.
So, well, I was going to say, let's just be clear for anybody who's teaching in Texas, honestly, these are dangerous.
It's a dangerous
And if it's like an open carry state, and there's like all these, I've seen professors talk about like, can you imagine if students can just walk in and just not like what you say, and they have guns?
And they have guns.
Oh my God! I mean, so let's just say that, and I'm sure I've only been at Brown for three to 4 years, and before the provost left, I worked with him and I talked to him about the purchase of Mumia Abdul Jamal's archive, and I had all my notes out and I said this and this because you can imagine the Fox spin, like Brown buys cop killers, and you're like, no, he's likely a wrongfully convicted man. He's got, there's a bunch of reasons why we should have that archive. And so it felt so liberating to think that this university that has these ties and origins to slavery is now purchasing this archive of a Black radical. Like this to me feels like I know every day that I'm like blessed to be here. Now, when I was teaching at the university, so when I was teaching at Temple, and there's a class called Minorities in Crime, I was like, you need to change this to the university. I don't want to be in this department if you are doing this, because teaching at Temple was like being at HBCU. It was like the United Nations when you sit there. I mean, it was truly an amazing place, but the disparity between a mostly white faculty and a mostly Black and brown and poor student body, a lot of the white faculty acted as though they were beneath their own students. And now look how they're treating their own graduate students, right, with this recent labor issues that they've had. When I was at Delaware, I actually would take my book because I knew the ideas would be controversial to them. You're sitting in a class where there's it's the son of a police officer. I intimately understand that level of racism because I was around those types of white people growing up, and I get how they think and I get how they see the world. And so I guess what I actually had them do is assignment 1, read the appendix and the methods of my book first. I don't want you to read the conclusions. I want you to read the appendix and the methods. And we spent a week on that. This is how this research was conducted and done. And to understanding the difference between empirical work and opinion. And again, I don't agree with some of this because again, we should just believe Black people. Like we don't need empirical data, but for these students, and I go back to when I was a young girl and I grew up Catholic, so the idea of homosexuality was like a sin, and I was raised that way. But the moment I sat in a gender and sexuality class in a sociology department for the first time, I developed new ideas about how the world could work, what was possible in gender and sexuality, and I understood the level of prejudice that was put in my brain. And so I became a different person. In the best light, we change people. And I've seen so many educators give up and be like, I cannot persuade these kids. And I'm like, but that's your job. You're a teacher, right? We're teachers too. So isn't that part of our mission? So I would not give up. Now there were some people that, I'm just like, I cannot, there's nothing, I've done all the things, I can't. I have made you see and you have chosen to not see, right? And that's kind of like the seeing and the feeling. I just, and the other thing I used to use was comedy. I would actually use Dave Chappelle. I would show them when comedians are some of the best sociologists and critics, because they make us laugh at the things that we see as almost like air, right? If you're a white person and you don't realize the privilege you have in a criminal case. So Chappelle's I Plead the Fifth, when they reverse they have a white collar criminal and a so-called street criminal, and they treat the street criminal like the white collar criminal. They worry about his reputation. They worry about how he's going to get arrested. I'll turn myself in at a time that's convenient for me. And all the kids would be laughing. They'd be, and I would say to him, why are you laughing? Why? And then they'd tell me honestly. So that actually felt very disarming, is to use comedy and critique. And then through that building of trust, we would decode things about race. So I would use an example of a white realtor and a white family. And I'd say the dialogue was something like, this is a good family neighborhood. Okay. I was like, oh, is there crime here? No, it's a good family neighborhood. And I would say, I need one person to decode what was just said here between two white people. Okay. And it was a very diverse class. So it's like, I'm asking them to translate, and then some brave white person will go, they're saying there's no black people here. But what are the racist assumptions in this? This is a good family neighborhood. Well, black and brown people don't have fully functional families. It's right. So then I get them to, but I felt like that was the trust I had to build. And I'm going to tell you, it is exhausting.
Yes.
I'm exhausted. I'm just remembering all this, and I'm thinking how easy it was to step into the class. I saw Paul Butler, who's a critical race theorist, and I texted him. They thought Paul Butler was conservative. I was like, "Are you guys at Paul Butler? They think you're conservative." And we were shocked, because back in the day when he published his book in 2014, it was a radical. He's a radical, And I remember him being portrayed as a black radical when it reads so. Like he's pussyfooting around what he really wants to say. And then in his second book, Chokehold, he comes with more force and power. But it was amazing how the brown students perceived that same work from that time. It was almost like time was changing so quick. I had a good recollection of it, but these kids, they grew up with Michelle Alexander. They've been calling it the new Jim Crow since they were 12. I was like, what is this? And that is what they're scared of in Florida. Because if I don't have to work as hard, now I can get to new things. Like, here's what a racial degradation ceremony is. Here was what white supremacy looks like when people don't have hoods on. Here's why the police allowed Charlottesville to occur, and they watched. They're more evolved thinkers. I mean, and it's not because they're quote unquote high achieving at Brown. It's because they've grown up with these dialogues, like the new Jim Crow when they were children. So little. I mean, 2010 for them. I mean, how old were they? It's scary to think about. They were 10 years old, 9 years old.
Yeah, they went to school to formative years with black president.
They already have the vocabulary.
Whatever he did, it's not like a big change.
And I said, if I would have published my book in 2016 and said the words, it's funny. There's a lot of words of racism, and racism is in the book a million times. The one thing that's not in the book that I never say is white supremacy. Because in 2015, if you said white supremacy, it meant that people had hoods on. It was not in the vernacular. But now, if I write a book, I have to evolve the language now with the readers that now have a more vibrant vocabulary to which they talk about racial violence. We have a more educated, evolved public in 5 years.
But your book will not be in the library in Texas or in Florida.
No, I don't.
I don't know. I mean, they assign it. They assign Charlottesville. After Charlottesville, there was an order for 350 books of Cook County, and I was like, who the heck is buying 350 books in Charlottesville? It was the intro to sociology class, and my heart, I found the professor. I said, I will speak in that class. Zoom me in. Because the bravery by which that professor, to intro to sociology, year after Charlottesville, to assign that book, I was like, I'm gonna speak in that class, and I was like, you all are the change right now, because they wanted to shut you all up, and now you're reading this book that they don't want you to see, and you're talking to me, and I'm zooming into that space, right? So, I don't know. I find hope in these small things. These seem so small when we think about what's really going on, but.
No, I just wanted that, you know. From you, I wasn't saying no. I wanted you to say all that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's how I'm trying to. That's how I cope too. I mean, we all have to have hope to sleep at night and to keep going another day.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna make a quick comment because we also need to.
Yes.
No, but you're all welcome to continue the conversation. Actually, we have coffee, beverage, right? Even food in the kitchen. We can continue. I just wanted to say, like, I worked as a teacher in Brazil for 10 years before becoming like anything like a scholar, and I'm a very pessimistic historian. I'm a very optimistic teacher, and I think like ending this panel, this workshop, talking about how can we deal with such difficult topics that make us so pessimistic, but at the same time, how can we think like of conversations like this as an initiative, and perhaps education of a new generation as one way. Maybe not to bring a revolution, but like changing a little bit every day.
No, it's a revolution.
That's it.
I just wanted the steps. It was at the very beginning for me. It's not because if not, I wouldn't be teaching. I have the same similar experience at Ben, and I have a colleague actually that we were saying, no, this is. We like to disrupt the elites, you know, because you see there are some kids, like here, I guess, kids from the elite, and in class they are like, because we all have our ways, but I just wanted, because I am trying to get also for my own practice from everyone, and so you have said here things that are great, this is what I wanted. It wasn't pessimism. And yes, there is pessimism, but it's a pessimism, progressive pessimism, something bringing more. We need that pessimism because if not, everything la vida es bella, you know? But so thank you.
Right. Who's more hopeful than Black people, right? If there's anybody that's super pessimistic, right, it's the former slaves. And somehow we just keep.
We weren't supposed to be here. We are survivors just for the fact of being here.
Right.
And you know that teacher that says, I am the wildest dream of myself. This is true. But they just kept dreaming without even the possibility of imagining whatever our reality. So us just for the fact of that we are here now. As Black people, so we have to keep dreaming. This is wild, but I also, I am a professor, so I like to get. So what do you do? How you do it? It's not saying that I'm not going to dream. No, I wouldn't be here.
On this note, I would like to thank you all for the opportunity of staying here.